And straight into our first session today. If you haven't ever witnessed Daniel Silke's amazing keynote sessions, then you're in for a treat. But Daniel, if I can ask you to come up to the stage and wow us, please.
Thank you very much. Jumbo. Hello, everybody. Hello, it's a nice long stage. I can walk all the way down the side and get excited by everybody on this side as well. Thank you very, very much, Matthew. Thank you, Bench Events, for inviting me to come back and give you a brief journey of macroeconomic and political highlights of Africa. It's a big topic to cover in about 30 minutes. In fact, it's an impossible topic to cover in 30 minutes, so I hope you will enjoy the pace that is necessary to do this justice. I must just say I'm delighted to be back in Nairobi. I'm delighted to see the development here in Nairobi. And I took a flight to get here from Cape Town, where I live, a new Kenya Airways direct service into Nairobi from Cape Town, which really does just epitomize the opening up of the continent. It epitomizes how a good airports company like ours in Cape Town, together with an expanding airline like Kenya Airways, can now provide these intra-African air services that simply didn't exist a couple of years ago. So I'm delighted that one can transport oneself on a physical manifestation of change across the African continent. But talking about Africa is not just talking about Africa. And talking about the current economic concerns, challenges, opportunities on the continent demands also some attention to what's happening in the outside world, my friends. Now, I must tell you, I'm not part of Bench Events. I'm a consultant. I can do what I like, more or less, on stage. They might never invite me back. But it is important to look at some of the big global issues that are affecting Africa and, for that matter, the world right now, particularly for us in emerging economies or perhaps even in frontier economies, of which many of the African economies really are regarded as frontier economies. It's not just, of course, in the United States where there is a degree of disruption. There's a degree of concern in the United Kingdom as well about the after effects of Brexit. There are opportunities for Africa as a result of the leave, which perhaps will occur at the end of March. We'll perhaps mention some of those a little bit later. But there is disruption in the air. There are geopolitical risks that affect just about everyone everywhere. And certainly we are not immune to this on this continent. Coming from Africa, although sometimes we in Cape Town think we're something else, by the way, not quite Africa, but coming from Africa, for us, we are all aware of sort of a traditional African proverb. When elephants fight, as the old proverb goes, it's the grass that suffers. And who are the elephants at the moment, in a sense, who are fighting? These are the elephants that are fighting. The United States and China locked into something of a, you can call it a trade war. I prefer to call it some sort of trade spat. It can manifest itself in a much greater trade conflict, which can engulf many parts of the world. It does also create a degree of concern and instability as smaller economies get locked into this vortex of conflict between these big two global superpowers, and the two key global superpowers really for all of us to watch over the course of the next while. So there is global concern and global risk, but at the same time, when you move across the African continent, you see immense change happening. Some of this change, of course, is on the drawing board. That's New Cairo, by the way, on the top of that screen. That's proposed developments in Dakar, Senegal. Very nice drawings. Let's hope I live long enough to see some of these important changes. Even in Nairobi, we are seeing the development. Look, there's real development here. There's also proposed development in Nairobi. In Rwanda, we've seen tremendous improvements there as well. In Addis Ababa, new overground transportation systems. This is a continent that's adapting and changing very, very quickly, and it's new and it's fresh. And that's why the investors are coming to this continent. I get very excited about Africa. But of course, there are challenges as well. I get excited about the new transportation networks that exist, certainly in Ethiopia, here, of course, in Kenya as well. Yes, there are issues relating to the finance, I must say, of some of these developments. Yes, there are issues relating to the heavy involvement of the Chinese in particular, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But the infrastructure story is ultimately what what will make or break this continent in terms of delivering, not just to you as investors, because you are part of the equation. The key issue is to deliver to the people, to deliver to the millions who will clamor for jobs going forward. We are seeing this global interest in the continent. Yes, the Chinese are here, but everybody else has been coming in. The Indians, the Turks, Monsieur Macron from France. I love some of these photo opportunities that some of these leaders have when they come across the continent. Love it. And some look more relaxed and some look more awkward, by the way. There's Mrs. Merkel coming in from Germany. Of course, I must just say, and I can say it in jest, my favorite visit of any leader to Africa recently was, of course, and you know, as something of a political animal that I am, I can't get enough of watching this particular video, mainly because she makes me feel so good about myself. But there you go. The interest is remarkable on the continent. Now, I have to say, there are all sorts of different players who are maneuvering themselves into investing on the African continent. The chart on the screen is a little bit small, not really ideal for you, but it gives you an idea of who are the really big investors who've increased their investment onto the African continent just in the course of the last 7-8 years or so. The guys who are coming in, it's not just China. So we shouldn't just see this as a China play or China interest. The Russians are coming in, the Thais are coming in, the Turks, the Mexicans, the Indians, and indeed the Qataris and the Saudis as well. Gulf investors, very, very big. It's interesting to see on that particular chart, and if it works, I've just highlighted it there. You can see that the United States has been a laggard when it comes to big ticket investments into the African continent. We seem to be off the radar screen, at least from an infrastructure point of view for the United States. That may well change over the course of the next while, but the US certainly has relinquished to a degree its ascendancy in dealing with Africa as all of these other nations look to find opportunities. And indeed, when you go across the continent and you go to a city like Accra, you see the involvement and investment of other nations. The Philippines are investing. The Turks have invested in that big interchange in Accra. It's not just a China play, for that matter. But Africa, of course, finds herself now in an important strategic player geopolitically in the world. At the United Nations, African countries' votes are being courted. And indeed, I think the big global power plays between the United States and China will end up in terms of getting those votes on contentious issues into the future. And a contentious issue into the future will be activities in the South China Sea. So yes, there's Chinese investment on this continent, and I would welcome it, but watch out for some of these issues coming back to bite all of us when it comes to some of the big geopolitical issues that we will all face. Certainly there's interest in Africa for security reasons, and there we see the United States expanding her role in terms of a military and strategic and intelligence role across the continent. Yes, the Gulf states have come in big time. They've come in to secure their positions. They've also come in for food security issues as well. The big global power plays also still occurring on this continent. And we could well argue, if we wanted to be a little cynical, which I'm allowed to be, I must tell you, that many of the global leaders who've come in here over the course of the last few months or so have been worried about migration, have been worried about this push of people from Africa across the Mediterranean. And it is therefore in their interests to invest in Africa to keep these economies ticking over, to prevent that kind of migration in a Europe that's becoming more and more concerned about issues relating to immigrants and migration in general. So Africa is indeed now a lot more important. It's on the front burner of all of these big issues. What about the economy? Well, the global economy itself has ticked over quite nicely over the course of the last year or so, but the new projections, and again, you can't see it too clearly on the chart, but the new projections coming through for next year, and this is from the OECD. We expect the IMF to come out with similar projections next year, which simply show that global GDP probably now is as good as it gets. And we are expecting a slowdown in most of the world, including the United States, in the course of the next 12 to 18 months or so. Across in emerging markets, though, yes, there may be a slowdown here and there, but the Indian economy is going to continue to be buoyant. The Chinese economy, relatively buoyant. I'll come back to that in a moment. A general slowdown across big markets across the world is expected over the course of the next year or so. So countries, particularly more vulnerable or smaller economies like some of the African economies, have to position themselves for what could be a global sort of mini turndown in the course of the next year or so. What's interesting, I think, is that Africa looks as though it's going to buck the trend when it comes to the expected plateauing of the global economy over the course of the next year. Indeed, when you look at the charts, and just have a look at this one, you can just see that Africa's growth for 2019 is expected to be at around 4.2%. Now, global growth for the next year or so is expected to be about 2.9%. So you guys, as investors, you're in the right place at the right time. As that global economy starts to slow, yes, the opportunities for greater returns on investment return to the African continent. And it's interesting, it's really a cycle. We saw 10, 15 years ago how the global credit crunch put pressure on markets in the West in particular, low rates of return on investment, and the desire to be more adventurous with capital injections. As that US economy grew, less of a desire to invest outside of the safer jurisdictions of the West. I think the slowdown that we are going to see by and large in the next year or two or three will ultimately be beneficial as investors again return to find good rates of return on investment, certainly in emerging and developing markets as well. Again, global growth for next year, 2.9%. Africa is going to buck that trend and will be the second fastest growing region in 2019 at just over 4% or so. The charts, of course, tell the story of an African recovery. We've gone through what has been, and I'll just here because the pointer doesn't work so well, we've gone through the sort of dip of 2016, which I'm pleased to say I got right when I addressed this audience a couple of years ago, and I warned about a downturn. I don't always get it right, by the way, but we have seen good increases across most of the regional economies over the course of the last year or so, and we are looking at sustained increases in economic growth over the course, again, over the 2019 period or so. The big GDP winners for 2017, I think you all know them, and many of you have been active in those jurisdictions. Certainly, I think you get the idea that indeed the Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, certainly here in Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, all have been good success stories over 2017, and they've all shown, the green shoots of improvement going forward. On projections for this year and perhaps into next year, again, the winners, and there are some losers, by the way, but the winners really are going to be this sort of section of the graph here. Ethiopia is still going to do about 8% GDP growth. The Côte d'Ivoire still doing very well. Rwanda, Senegal, Tanzania, Ghana, Kenya again doing nicely. I hate to go to sort of the end of this particular chart because it includes my home country of South Africa, but the laggards, clearly, the laggards are those big economies, South Africa, Angola, and to a degree Nigeria as well, whose economy still has yet to revive adequately. And those big economies have dragged down the overall African average over the course of the last year or so. If we sort of look forward for the next 10 years or so, which are the expected growth markets from an economic point of view, again, it's the usual suspects, I suppose, and what a pleasure it is for them to be the usual suspects. Ethiopia, Rwanda, Mozambique expected to very well, if it can harness those natural gas deposits, it could propel that country. It's not just natural gas, but good governance is going to be needed to propel Mozambique to be in the top 10 or so. But again, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Tanzania, Uganda, and of course Kenya, all looking at sustained, positive, and really, really good growth over the course of the next decade or so. I'm a political animal sort of at heart. I like to see political change, for better or for worse. If it's for worse, I get more work, by the way. If change is for good, nobody ever wants to hear about good change. But here's the good change on the continent. A new crop of leaders are starting to challenge some of the old ideologies that have pervaded on this continent and elsewhere in the world for that matter. In Ethiopia, we see a move to begin a public-private participation process that could be quite dramatic in enhancing value in that country going forward. In Angola, a country, if I might say, that has been historically a Marxist country, now we see efforts to begin a process also of privatizing many of the ailing state-owned enterprises in that country again. And with a high oil price on global markets, Angola once again can become, I think, a fashionable destination. Here in Kenya, a model, in a sense, of what happens when you have two conflicting major political forces who manage a handshake and can manage their own particular conflict. And this is what stability is all about. That's what confidence is all about. Long, may I say, may that handshake last in that fashion. But that indeed is what has put this country back on track. And those of you here certainly understand the improvements in sentiment towards Kenya over the course of the last year or so. In my home country, in South Africa, a tough job for our new president, Cyril Ramaphosa. He's got ghosts from the past to deal with, I might add, and he's got a state that in many cases is quite dysfunctional. And, Ramaphosa is a little bit like the Ethiopian leader. When you are a reformer, when you want to change, wow, do you face uphill from those who have vested interests, from those who feel as though they're not going to enjoy the benefits that they have enjoyed over the course of the last while. And that, of course, puts South Africa, at least I think for the moment, on pause as Ramaphosa attempts to extract what he can and gain, in a sense, a power base within his own political party. I used to show pictures of the African continent, maps, and I do love maps. I've always shown maps in all my presentations. I used to show a map of just how big Africa is and how you can fit the whole of the world onto the African continent. I tend to like this map now because I think this map is almost, probably even more important because it's a people-centered map. It's not a size-centered map, it's people. Just look at those populations. Those are the current populations of the African continent right now. Kenya, of course, 51 million people on this, in this country. Angola, 30 million people. I mean, the population of Kenya, almost twice that of Australia, if you put it in global terms or so. This is going to be the biggest challenge for Africa going forward. Yes, Africa is what we call the second supercontinent in terms of population growth until 2100 or so. 1 billion people over the course of the next 30 years or so are going to be urbanized across this continent. The test for this continent is how to keep those 1 billion people in relatively comfortable settings, be it job-wise, be it social services, and how do our cities also contribute to the creation of capital and indeed growth in various markets. In the next 10 years alone, the population of Lagos and Kinshasa are going to be around 18 million, 15 million or so. I mean, remember, London has a population of 7 million, 8 million or so. If you take the big extended picture, Kinshasa already double the size of a city like London in population. The figures become more astounding. By 2050, 37% of all global births will be on this continent. 37%. I should dispense with everything else and just put up that slide for all of us to ponder on all sorts of issues. The plus side of all of those births and young people is that there will be workers. The workers of the future are going to be centered on this continent as long as there is work for the workers to do. And that is the real challenge. The real challenge is creating new jobs. Between now and 2035, Africa will need to create about 18 million new jobs every single year just to keep pace with the rapidly growing population of this continent. That's nearly 50,000 new jobs daily just to maintain current levels. It's a frightening statistic, and sometimes it's almost too big a statistic to really relax about. The challenge in this industry will be to take some of those potential jobs for you to be at the forefront of adding to that, along with other key industries into the future. What can Africa get from what's happening in the outside world? How does Africa, for that matter, begin to address this issue of creating jobs? Well, changing conditions globally can help the continent. Already today, Chinese wage labor costs have risen and risen substantially, and that means that companies, corporations, will be looking for cheaper manufacturing jurisdictions across the world. Africa, indeed, being one potential one. Here, I'll take you into a factory, a shoe factory in Addis Ababa. It's a Chinese factory, and it employs thousands of Ethiopians in fairly low-wage clothing or textile or shoe production. As jobs move, and jobs are likely to move from China to Africa, this will probably become more prevalent. And it's one of the reasons why China and other economies have been interested in Africa. They know where the workers of the future are going to be, and they know that this is a positive potential job creation. It's a win-win for both countries or both jurisdictions. As Ethiopia has been able to harness this kind of job creation and have diversified the economy, which is very important as well, that country's graphs, it's so nice to look at a country where graphs go up. I come from a country where graphs just keep on going in the wrong direction. And when I look at Ethiopia, I mean, the GDP has soared. FDI into Ethiopia soared as well over the course of the last decade. And you can say what you like about Chinese FDI. It has been associated. It's been associated with debt, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but it has also been associated with growth, certainly in the Ethiopian case. So, there's good and bad in all of this. Yes, there are headwinds. The headwinds, of course, relate to the big global economic positions. The United States economy is now in its 9th year of GDP increase. That tide will turn, and no doubt there will be ongoing effects of both currency wars across the world and also of trade protectionism that we see, which can dampen in the short term the economies of the developing market. You in Kenya, for us in South Africa, and for many other non-oil exporting nations, the price of oil at $80 to $100 a barrel has a dramatic effect on one's economy. We're all in the same boat, in a sense, on this issue, but it's been exacerbated by a strong US dollar. And that cycle of the strong US dollar also together, almost in a perfect storm for some of our emerging and developing economies going forward. I suspect that cycle will change, certainly in terms of the US dollar, as the US economy begins to plateau in the course of the next 18 to 24 months. It could plateau a little earlier, depending on some of the economic shenanigans, political shenanigans that are occurring in Washington at the moment. For many emerging market economies, of course, we have been reliant upon commodity exports. Commodity prices also depressed, partially as a result of the stronger US dollar, again, affecting some of our markets going forward. And investors in many parts of the Western world, to use that particular term, have not been that keen to invest in emerging markets. They've seen higher interest rates in the United States. They've seen a growing economy make those jurisdictions that bit more attractive for investment. So it's been a battle for the emerging markets of this world, and this continent has felt it, of course. We've seen currency weakness. We've seen stock weakness as well over the course of the last year or so. In China, there's also, in a sense, a challenge. The trade wars, and what can we say about the sort of US-China spat? It may well be a strategy from the United States to try and dampen the rise of China going forward in a big picture geopolitical strategy board game that seems to be playing itself out. Yes, the trade protectionism that we see and the wars are beginning to have an impact on the Chinese economy. And it is important for us because we do a lot more business with China than we ever have. The Chinese GDP looks fairly solid at 6.5%, but if you drill down into some of the other Chinese stats, Chinese retail sales have been down, China's manufacturing has also been a lot more muted going forward, an indication of the effects of the trade tariffs. And from our point of view as well, the Chinese investment in infrastructure has flatlined and indeed has declined in the recent reporting period. And we, of course, gain traction from China, whether you're in Kenya, whether you're in South Africa, from the export from our countries to China of raw materials. If their infrastructure spend begins to drop, then indeed those imports from us also will tend to drop accordingly. So I think from the Chinese point of view, we need to watch this issue. And I always say to any government that I advise, or to any corporate, but mainly to governments, don't put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to looking at China. Look at that broad basket of investors who have interest, just in case that Chinese economy does become a little more strained as a result of what we've seen globally. Trade with Sub-Saharan Africa, between Sub-Saharan Africa and China, has been a little rocky over the course of the last reporting period there. And I think you can start to see, in a sense, the changing nature of the Chinese economy and these new pressures beginning to slow some exports back into China. What's positive, of course, is the Silk Road development. Aptly named, I might add, the Silk Road development. I really like that from the Chinese, I must tell you, which can lock in, and I think this is important, certainly for our economies, it can lock in the whole of East Africa, in a sense, to this, well, it is a remarkable outreach from China. Now, there's political pullback on this from some countries. I must tell you, it's not going to be that easy for China just to have her say in the transportation of goods and services across so many jurisdictions. But the potential is to create a very large economic development zone that has the potential to be positive for these economies. But my big concern, I suppose, about Africa and the challenges remain in the current environment, high levels of debt. The balance sheet of so many African countries in terms of foreign currency public debt and local currency public debt are indeed a little troubling. For many of our economies, we shouldn't go higher than a 50 to 60% debt to GDP ratio. And you can just see that, let me not trip over myself, you can just see that in the case of Mozambique, Ghana, Gabon, even here in Kenya, issues relating to excessive debt begin to be troublesome. And they're troublesome also for foreign investors looking to come in. And I think we must flag this issue indeed. The issuance of African Eurobonds has been huge. African countries with fast-growing debt, Congo and Equatorial Guinea, Zambia, a problematic country in terms of its debt, as great as it is, we have to flag these issues and watch them quite carefully. And I just wanted to show you this particular statistic from the Institute for Security Studies from South Africa, which showed that in 2014, before the surge in Chinese finance, 15 African countries had IMF loans with a total of $5 billion US. Today, 20 African countries have loans totaling $15 billion. So there is, in a sense, a strange correlation and a danger, and I just issue it as a warning. If you get into too much debt with China, that can also come back to haunt you. And the IMF have seen many, many African countries knocking on their door as a result. The positives, of course, in my view, generally outweigh many of these issues that I've flagged. Africa is opening for business. That single African air transport market starting at last. And my example from Cape Town to Kenya, in part an example of that. Ease of travel across this continent has improved tremendously, notwithstanding some visa bottlenecks here and there, and these large airlines. And I get jealous because our own airline back in South Africa can't quite compete anymore, I must tell you. But these airlines starting to open up the continent and starting to provide intra-Africa transportation. New airports and new facilities in Ghana have contributed to an improvement in receipts and arrivals across the African continent. International tourist arrivals into this continent growing at an incredibly fast pace. Tourist arrivals, the most in the world in 2017, and in terms of tourism receipts across the across the world, commensurate with Europe and the Middle East in 2017. Again, you're in the right place at the right time. You learn more about the hotel pipeline on the continent over the course of the next 3 days or so. Again, we are seeing continued and sustained interest in terms of the pipeline across the country, across the continent. And indeed also, in terms of the top 10 markets for hotels, hotel pipelines, yes, Egypt, Nigeria, yes, a little drop-off in the course of the last year or so, but great progress in terms of hotel rooms and keys in Ethiopia, even in South Africa with a slumped or at least a static market or so, and across so many other jurisdictions again, particularly Cape Verde, where they have some of the biggest rooms in room size on this continent, I believe, and of course here in Kenya as well. We are all here because we believe the markets are going to grow. We are all here because we believe that consumerism and disposable income is likely to increase, providing our Africans with greater travel opportunities and imperatives to do business. And for a continent, we are beginning to address those bottlenecks in terms of the continental free trade area that I believe can contribute to greater cooperation across this amazing continent. I should get out more. I get very excited about some of these issues. I just see the progress taking place. The big issue to me is going to be, can we create an environment in which we trade with each other? I've been saying this for years. I've been pulling out my hair. That's why there's not much more hair left on my head, because I want us to trade with each other. And at last, we are seeing green shoots in terms of creating an enabling environment for this. Clearly, we need better infrastructure. Clearly, we need an improvement in the ease of doing business. And again, we see Kenya, by the way, ranked second in the Ernst & Young Africa Attractiveness Index, only beaten by Morocco. There's something for Kenya to aim at in the course of the next year or so. But generally speaking, the better the infrastructure, the better the correlation with ease of doing business across the continent. And we are seeing substantial changes again. And again, it's the same countries. It's Cote d'Ivoire, it's Rwanda, it's Kenya, it's even South Africa for that matter, and I'm pleased to see on this particular chart. I'm getting to the end of the presentation, and I think what's important to understand is that we are in a transitory phase across the continent. We are moving from low-wage-based agricultural employment to something else, to a mix of manufacturing, to a mix of services employment across this continent. And that's what's important to me going forward. We see that government services, transportation services, construction services, business services, retail, and manufacturing are now starting to change the dynamic of the employment and productivity sectors across Africa. We're shifting from agriculture, as important as it is, but we're shifting and diversifying, which I particularly like, but agriculture to me remains an incredible pivotal item, particularly for a country like Kenya going forward as well. So for our continent, a mix of factors have to be in place. And I suspect we are working on all of them. From an entrepreneurial and business growth base, to improving our institutions and governance, to integrating the continent regionally, to agricultural production, and indeed better IT and high-tech aspects of that, to creating an enabling environment for the millions who will be born and working on this continent for the next 10 years, and also, of course, to look at issues regarding inclusive growth and security. All of these factors together, important in terms of putting the puzzle together. And that's why I like this continent. Yes, for all of us who've looked at Africa for years, we can call it a risky continent. Is it really that risky anymore? I think there are those who find it now the next best thing, the next best alternative, the next growth phase, and the switch, I believe, to investment in Africa is on. The switch ain't off, my friends. It's on, firmly on. Welcome to this conference. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel.